Okay, so this is actually the second class in a 4-part series. And the first part that we talked about last week was mainly just a lot of very general information. Who is a Buddhist? What is Buddhism about? And just a lot of general information about Buddhism. And I guess the main substantive thing that we talked about last time was the life of Buddha and who he was, where he lived, and so forth. And since we don't have a lot of time, we have to cover all of Buddhism in 4 sessions of an hour and a half. I'm going to have to not repeat it all, but sort of plunge ahead. But everything is interconnected, so everything I said last week will probably get repeated again. And I think the one, and so where I'm going to start today is I'm going to start with what happened after Buddha died. What was a brief history of the history of Buddhism. And then the other thing I'm going to focus on today is the 4 Noble Truths, which are the essential key part of Buddhist philosophy for all Buddhists. And as I explained last time, Buddhists come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. When Buddha died, his followers, he knew ahead of time he was going to die. And when he was dying, just before he died, all of his followers eagerly asked him, saying, okay, you've taken care of this. And it turns out for 45 years. He was born, a little bit of a recap of his life. He was born the son of a prince into a very wealthy family. He actually was married and just had a child born when he began his spiritual career, which began around the age of 29. And then after that, he became an ascetic. He wandered, did spiritual practices under various people for about 6 years, until the age of 35. And at the end of it, he did extreme asceticism. But over and over again, the main question that drove his spiritual life was, how do we stop suffering? He thought that it was unacceptable that humans have to suffer. And his goal in his life, he said, there has to be a way where we can live without suffering. And he said, I'm determined, I'm going to find that. And so whenever he went to these earlier followers who taught him very, very deep, powerful meditation practices, in each case, he learned everything he could. But at the end of it, he said, I still don't know how to stop suffering. So I'm going to continue on. And eventually he even became, for quite a while, he was an ascetic. He practically died, eating practically, his bones were shriveling up, his skin, he was eating maybe 1 grain of rice a week and just almost dying. And even that wasn't working. So he tried everything he could, the most extreme things possible. And in the end, it finally occurred to him that there's a better way. And that's when he regained his health. And that's when he sat under the Bodhi tree. And that night he achieved full enlightenment through what he called the middle path. And this notion of the middle, as I talked about last time, is very important. Everything in Buddhism is always about sort of moderation, sort of doing things in the middle, not being extreme. And so when the Buddha achieved full enlightenment, he did it through a middle path. He did it through a path that was neither the huge sensory, luxury and all the, the wealth and good things that he had as the prince of a king. And he also didn't do it through the extreme asceticism of nearly starving himself to death and going through extreme conditions. He did it through a middle way. And that's the way that he taught. But at the end of his life, his followers said, and then for 45 years, until roughly the age of 80, he went around giving teachings, which is why there's a very large amount of Buddhist teachings recorded. His teachings were, all the things he taught when he was alive were recorded orally and passed down through an oral tradition for several hundred years before it finally got written down. But that was traditional in India. All the Vedas had been oral, and all of the Vedas have been passed down orally for, hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years, who knows how long. So that in India, they were extremely good at having almost perfect memorization. And in fact, they do that today with the Quran. I once saw a TV show where they have young boys who enter a contest from all over the Muslim world to memorize the Quran. And these people memorize the whole Quran. And not only do they memorize, and some of them are like 8, 10 years old, not only do they memorize the whole Quran, but they also have to memorize, there's a whole thing. You have to raise your voice at certain things. You have to have very special pronunciations. It's extremely complex in addition to just the words. And they do this, and what I thought was the most interesting thing is that most of them do this without knowing any Arabic. So they're just memorizing literally sounds. So it's possible to memorize quite a bit. But anyway, after that, the Buddhist scriptures got written down. And what are called the sutras are basically when Buddha would go around, he would give teachings to different people. And these are called the sutras. And there's thousands of these things because he taught for 45 years to many different groups of people. And to each group of people, he would try to teach to them what he felt they needed to hear. And so when he gave the teachings, they sort of became very scattered in many different things. And then later on, the monks came together and sort of organized all the teachings in an organized way so that it would be more helpful to the young monks who were trying to learn Buddhism. So those are the sutras. There are what they call the 3 baskets of Buddhism, sometimes called Pitaka. But the sutra basket is basically what Buddha taught, his words, and what happened to him, the events in his life, but mainly his words, what he taught. The Vinaya are the rules for the monks to follow. And the Vinaya is a very interesting document. The Vinaya happened. In the beginning, there was no Vinaya, but monks being humans got into trouble and all sorts of problems and were fighting amongst each other and all sorts of things. And so each time a problem arose, the Buddha would set down a rule to sort of make things easier for the monks to live. And in the Vinaya, they recorded not only the rule, but they also recorded the original incident that caused the rule. So unlike most set of rules, when you go to the Buddhist Vinaya, it not only tells you what the rule is, but it tells you why it existed, why it exists, and what situation it was attempted to be corrected. So it's sort of fascinating. And there's actually a lot of information about the Buddha, therefore, recorded in these Vinayas. And then the third group of teachings are called the Abhidharma, or the higher teachings. And these were the teachings that all of the monks assembled. So they took all of the teachings in the sutras and they tried to assemble a coherent teaching around them that would make it easier to teach what Buddha taught to the younger monks and so forth. And so that's called the Abhidharma. Okay, but at the end of his life, going back to where he got started, all of the Buddha's disciples asked him, please, give us an experienced monk to lead us. We need somebody to lead us. You took care of us for 45 years, and now we need somebody else. We need help. We need somebody to lead us. And what was interesting is the Buddha absolutely refused. He said, the Dharma will lead you. The Dharma means, and Dharma was a word that means many different things in many contexts, but the main meaning it usually has is it means Buddhist teachings. And Buddha said, I didn't discover these teachings. These aren't my teachings. This is the way the world really works. And so the Dharma is basically the way the world really works, but it's codified by what the Buddha taught us. So the Buddha said, I gave you all of these teachings. That's all you need. And he also said something to the effect of, be a lamp or island unto yourself, and then use these teachings to guide you. And the word he used, the reason why I say island or lamp is because the word he used has both meanings. And Buddha was very sophisticated in his use of language. And I think he meant both. In other words, the lamp, you have to follow your own spiritual path. And the lamp is within you. And yet you are in a certain sense, you're an island into yourself. Again, you have your own individual spiritual path you need to follow. And so there is, to this day, there is no Pope of Buddhism, if you like. And so as Buddhism spread, it became very diversified because there were very powerful, teachers who understood a lot, and each of them would sort of teach Buddhism as they went. And as Buddhism spread to all of these different countries, it took on a coloration of the traditions of those different countries. And so Buddhism can look extremely diverse. It can be things that look very philosophical, very abstract, or it can be very religious, like the Tibetan type of Buddhism that our center practices, with a lot of religious ceremonies and stuff, so forth. But anyway, despite that, at the core of all Buddhism, there are these Four Noble Truths. And it gives basically, these Four Noble Truths give the sort of the teaching of Buddha in a nutshell, and they underpin all the other forms of Buddhism around the world. And they also, and so everything sort of comes from them ultimately. Okay, so what I want to do now, so that's what happened when Buddha died. So when Buddha died, he became fully enlightened and he basically disappeared from our world. And I'm going to talk more about that because our world is something we call samsara. And a big part of the goal of this course is actually to teach you a lot of the main Buddhist terminology so that when you go into various teachings, you feel comfortable with the words that people are using and you have a basic understanding. And even though our center is a Tibetan center, I try to be somewhat even-handed and give a fairly broad picture of Buddhism, although I will definitely present the Tibetan view of Buddhism. But basically, almost all Buddhism can be related to the same thing, as I'll explain. So what happened when Buddha died? So when Buddha died, he of course, he was teaching in northern India, sort of the northern part. And some of the main places that happened in Buddhism were also even said to have happened in Nepal. And northern India and Nepal often fight over these sites because they want all the tourists. So, but anyway, he was sort of around just the very northern, sort of the northern central part of India. And he wandered extensively and gave many teachings. And when he gave teachings, he always used the local language of the people because he wanted people to understand them. And so initially what happened when Buddha died is Buddhism was mainly in India. However, the one thing that happened is there was almost immediately, and immediately after he died, all the Buddhists got together and they organized all the teachings and created an oral tradition and sort of all agreed on what was it that Buddha had taught. And those were the things, and different monks were given different parts to memorize and so forth. And so the core teachings were established almost immediately after Buddha died. But then shortly thereafter, actually Buddhism schismed. And they identify at least 18 different schools of Buddhism. Some people go as high as 30 different schools of Buddhism. And part of the division came about just from geography. People were scattered in different areas and it was hard to communicate. So they would have sort of a local teacher who was their best teacher. And so they sort of slightly varied. But the key thing, most of their divisions, I mean, the funny thing about Buddhism is that we tend to think of all religions in terms of a Christian point of view, because that's what our culture came from. And in a Christian point of view, the most important thing of all is what you believe. In the Reformation period, when you had the Protestants and the Catholics all fighting, they were burning each other up and killing each other. And it was almost always over views. They thought people didn't believe this or that was right or wrong. In Buddhism, it's really not about belief. There are many Buddhists who don't believe a lot of the core things about Buddhism. What makes you a Buddhist is basically the decision that you find Buddhism helpful and relevant to your life, and you have some confidence in the teaching. And the way you develop that confidence in the teaching is through practicing, trying out Buddhist teachings and seeing whether it works in your life. And if it works in your life, then you tend to develop confidence in the teachings, and you tend to believe more and more that they will help you, and you trust them and you try more things. The Buddha said, don't believe what I teach you just because I'm the Buddha. You have to test it out for yourself and decide for yourself whether what I taught you is really true or not. So there is that sense that runs through all of Buddhism, that it's absolutely critical to actually try things out and really see if it really works for you. And in fact, today I'm gonna get into these things where I'm gonna describe different realms of sentient beings. A sentient being is a being with a mind. And in Buddhism, we teach that there's more than just humans who have a mind. Animals are believed to have a mind, and there's even beings in other realms, heavenly realms and hell-like realms. But all of these sentient beings have a mind, and all of these places where they live are impermanent. They change. And we will also talk about rebirth today and how you can change between these different realms. And being a sentient being in all of these different realms is what we call samsara. So the world that you're living in and experiencing right now is part of the samsaric human realm, if you like. So when Buddha died, again, I'll come back to these other points as I go into the Four Noble Truths. So Buddhism divided up into all of these different divisions, and it gradually spread away from India. Probably the first big migration was down to areas around Sri Lanka, sort of off the south of India. That happened about the third, roughly, just to put dates in crude terms. Some of the dates are uncertain because in India, they didn't place a high value on calendars and stuff. So some of these dates are maybe plus or minus 50, 100 years. But that's just because that was the Indian culture of the time. But you can think roughly, you can think of Buddha living or dying around 500 BC. And so around the 3rd century BC is when they had this spread to the south, down to Sri Lanka and Thailand and places down like that. And that tradition, actually, that was established then still exists to this day. And we call it the Theravadan tradition. And it's probably the tradition that's probably closest to what it looked like under the Buddha. Although, of course, in 2,500 years of evolution, it's not identical itself, has evolved. But that is probably the closest thing we have to the original form of Buddhism as it was when Buddha lived. And the importance of the Theravadan tradition is also that it has a complete set of Buddhist text. It's written in a language called Pali, which is a simpler version. It's called a Prakrit language, a simpler language than Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a scholarly language of Buddhism, of India, that was established through the Vedas and so forth. But the Pali, it was probably very similar to what the Buddha actually spoke. Probably, they're unsure whether it was an actual dialect that Buddha actually spoke, but if not, it was very similar. It's like a simplified Sanskrit. And, but anyway, in this Pali language, we have a full collection of Buddhist scriptures as it was passed down. So all of the sutras, all of the Vinaya, and their version of the Abhidharma, their way of teaching organizing the teachings. And then after that, in India, there were ups and downs to Buddhism. And basically, a lot of it depended on the local rulers. If a local ruler liked Buddhism a lot, then Buddhism flourished. There was a powerful king, Ashoka, I think he was also around the 3rd century BC, who caused a huge amount of Buddhism to spread all throughout India because he was a very powerful king, ruled over a wide land and so forth. And over time, the other thing that happened is great Buddhist monasteries were established. Things like Nalanda was probably one of the most important ones. And these became great areas of Buddhist learning, where a huge amount of philosophy was established. And a lot of the later Buddhism, we actually did turn to Sanskrit because they would have debates with all of the various Hindus around them on various philosophical points. And since the Hindus focused on Sanskrit as a scholarly language, most of Buddhism eventually began to be written in Sanskrit as well. The other things that happened that were very important, the other thing that is a big deal is around the birth of Christ, a new tradition began in Buddhism that I'm going to talk about a lot in this course. It's called Mahayana Buddhism. Traditionally, we talk about Hinayana Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Hinayana Buddhism was the original Buddhism that the Buddha himself taught. People don't like to use the word Hinayana now because it means lesser vehicle, and Mahayana means great vehicle. And so for the people practicing the lesser vehicle, it's sort of slanderous. So that's why we call them Theravadan, or the elders now. And but the Hinayana Buddhism is the absolute foundation of Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism is built on top of Hinayana Buddhism. If Hinayana Buddhism didn't exist, neither would Mahayana Buddhism. And I think the Dalai Lama now calls the Hinayana form foundational Buddhism, because it is the foundation of all Buddhism. It is the key teachings from which the rest of Buddhism evolved. But the Mahayana Buddhism started around the birth of Christ, and it actually, over time, became the dominant form of Buddhism. And in fact, that's the Buddhism we practice in Tibet, the Tibetan version. That's what the Zen Buddhism is. In fact, that's every form of Buddhism that you run across, except for this Theravadan form, which is focused mainly around Sri Lanka and places like that. So all other Buddhism, Mahayana basically sort of took over and became more powerful. And however, I think the correct way to look at Mahayana Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism isn't like, in some ways, it's not a separate form of Buddhism, but it takes certain ideas of love and compassion, and it's more like an amplifying or an expanding or a huge amount of emphasis on certain aspects of Buddhism, particularly compassion and trying to help all other sentient beings become enlightened. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about bodhicitta, which is the main part of the core of Mahayana Buddhism. But I think you should, again, what I want to emphasize, sometimes people feel like there's almost like two religions. There's not. Even if you're a Mahayana Buddhist, you're practicing all the core Hinayana practices. It's just that you're adding on to them additional things. So I think that's the way to think about it. And so I'm going to try to explain that more clearly. So again, it's mainly this Mahayana version that spread to all the rest of the countries. And one of the early places it went to, of course, is China. Because China is this huge, powerful country right next to India. And in fact, we're lucky it did. In fact, it spread fairly early, around the 1st century BC is when the first monks started to go to China. And China has many different forms of Buddhism. And in fact, even Tibet, we have 4 different versions of Buddhism. Like I say, because we don't have this pope, there tends to be this sort of splitting and these different flavors of Buddhism. So in China, there's at least 10 different forms of Buddhism, and it's very complicated. And often, it was organized around great spiritual leaders. But the important thing of China for Buddhism is, as I'm going to explain later, eventually Buddhism in India got killed off, and almost all of the manuscripts in India got destroyed. And China is one of the big repositories of a complete set of Buddhist texts. And so this Chinese set of texts are critically important because they survive. And in many cases, we don't have the Sanskrit or Pali originals. So they've preserved a lot of very important Buddhist texts and Buddhist learning. Of course, in India, eventually too, India was a place where what is sometimes called Chan Buddhism. Today, for most of us today, we would recognize it as Zen Buddhism. That's sort of where Zen Buddhism originated. And then the Zen Buddhism in particular spread to Korea and then, of course, to Japan. And so it spread to Korea maybe around the 7th century AD, and then to Japan maybe around the 12th century AD. And again, even as Zen, you should not think there's one Zen. I think there's at least 4 major schools of Zen in Japan itself. Plus there's Korean forms of Zen, Chinese forms of Zen. Again, so Buddhism is quite diverse. It's not just one single thing. And then the other important place that it spread to, so it sort of spread to China, sort of heading, is that west, I guess? Or east, I don't know, that part of the world, I'm a little confused. But anyway, the other place it spread was north. And it spread, of course, you're in Nepal, so it's not that far to go to Tibet. So it spread north to Tibet. And that happened, and that's important for us because, our center is a Tibetan center. And that happened about 770 AD. And in Tibet, there were actually at least 2 different waves of Buddhism that spread. So there was an original version that was spread by Padmasambhava from India around 770. And then one of the rulers in Tibet didn't like Buddhism, and he sort of pretty much killed it off. And then another great Indian spiritual scholar called Atisha around 1000 AD went to Tibet. And that's when Buddhism in Tibet was sort of firmly established. And from that point on, it really took off. And then later and then of course there was various corruptions, or around 1400 AD is when our version of Tibetan Buddhism started by Tsongkhapa. And he was a great reformer, and he sort of reformed. Again, things were falling apart a little bit. So there are 4 different Tibetan lineages, and that's useful to know. And actually in Santa Fe, we have centers for all 4 different traditions. And we also have a fairly large Tibetan population. For some reason, the Tibetans think that Santa Fe in some way resembles ancient Tibet. I'm not sure. I guess it's high mountain country, very dry. I'm not quite sure how it quite works, but it seems to be a very popular place for Tibetans to go to. And so we have all 4. The earliest form of Buddhism was the Nyingma tradition, which was established by Padmasambhava. It has a heavy emphasis on meditation. The next one was the Kagyu, which was formed around 1000 AD by Marpa and Milarepa and people like that. And that continues to today. And we have a stupa center in Santa Fe that represents that. And that's really meditative. Milarepa was a very famous, he was one of these guys that went into caves and meditated for years on end. So it's heavily meditative. Around 1073, the Sakya version of Buddhism was established. And that's important because those are the scholars of Buddhism. Those were the people who translated a lot of the texts from India, from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And they did this amazing— I didn't hear that name. It was Sakya. It's Sakya. Yeah, I should have mentioned, please ask any questions as you go along. It's important that, I mean, this class is for you. And so anything that you don't understand, just unmute yourself and ask a question. So the Sakya, Sakya, was very important. There was particularly a person named Sakya Pandita who led a lot of these translation efforts. And the Tibetans did they worked very hard to be very accurate in all of their translations. Even it's said that their writing was sort of developed to be able to translate these Buddhist scripts. And then and then after that, around 1400 roughly, was Lama Tsongkhapa, who started the Gelugpa tradition, which is the tradition that the Dalai Lama belongs to, actually. Although the Dalai Lama tries to be very even-handed, because he has to represent all Tibetans. But nonetheless, he has always traditionally belonged to the Gelugpa sect, which is by far the largest version of Tibetan Buddhism. For most of us, and the Gelugpa tradition is also a very scholarly. Lama Tsongkhapa was like a child prodigy, and he wrote many deep scholarly philosophical works. And so the Gelugpa tradition is also a very scholarly tradition. And in fact, the Sakya is rather small. And so the one helpful thing for people around, for people like us, is that the Gelugpa does emphasize a lot of teachings. And that's why our center gives so many teachings. So often in our center, we have people from, the Zen tradition or some of these or Kagyu traditions that will often come to our center to give teachings just because we offer a lot. Whereas a lot of these other centers focus more heavily on meditation. And while they do give teachings, it often isn't such a big part of them, part of what they do or what they emphasize. And so anyway, that's just a rough way that Buddhism spread. So it gives you sort of a rough idea how it's, and of course, then when the Chinese invaded Tibet around 1949 and so forth, then that caused, of course, all the Tibetans to spread around the world, and actually was greatly beneficial to the rest of us, because otherwise these people in Tibet probably would never have told us about anything. They were a very sort of closed society previously. So let me just ask, are there any questions about this? I know it's a lot of information to throw at you all at once, but I think it's just sort of helpful to see how it spread. And wherever Buddhism spread, it was always taught in the local language. And it often, it became sort of, it's natural when you live in a country to sort of take on the coloration of that country. So when you were in Tibet, the Tibetans always loved a lot of, ceremony, dressing up and elaborate things and stuff. That's part of their culture. And so Buddhism became very religious. If you go to a Zen Buddhist center, it's very austere. The buildings are absolutely beautiful architecture, but they tend to be, they focus mainly on meditation, and they're very austere, and they're almost closer to a philosophical version, although they are actually Mahayana Buddhists. And they do have their own scholars. But anyway, Buddhism can look very different, but underneath it all, it is the same. Okay, so there's no questions? Okay, so now I'm going to go on to the main teachings. So I told you that Buddha's goal when he went on this ascetic journey was to find an end to suffering. And what Buddha said is, he says, I found it. And that end to suffering can be given different terms. It can be called enlightenment. Another term we will use is liberation from samsara. And once the Mahayana schools came into existence, it actually turned out that there's a slight difference in meaning between these two, which I'm going to explain. But essentially, Buddha's Four Noble Truths directly have to do with suffering. So I'm going to first just give you the terminology. I'm just going to do them. I'll give you a brief description, and then we're going to go into each one separately in more detail, because that's when you really begin to see how it works. And it's sort of a radical notion according to the way we live at the West. Okay, so the Four Noble Truths are called true suffering, true cause, true cessation, and true path. And one way that these things are taught is often through a medical analogy, which I think is actually quite helpful. So in the medical analogy, the issue is, as I said before, we suffer, and I'm going to go more into that suffering and how we suffer and how to think about that suffering, because the Buddhist view of it is quite interesting. And it may be different than what you normally think, although there are parts of it are the same. So suffering you can think of as, in a medical analogy, is like having a disease. You've got this disease, suffering. So how are you going to cure it? Well, the first thing you need is you need a doctor, and Buddha is considered to be the doctor. And what Buddha is going to tell you is that suffering is not just accidental. It didn't fall on top of us out of the blue. It's not random, but there's actually a reason why we suffer. There's a cause of suffering. And it's very similar to the medical analogy. Maybe we have some type of virus, some type of germ. There is a cause. If people are sick or suffering due to a medical cause, there's a reason why they suffer. People just don't, are healthy unless there's some cause that causes them to have some type of disease. So with that in place, then the next one, true cessation, has to do with the fact that Buddha says, not only do you have this disease suffering, but it's curable. You have a curable disease. And that's what true cessation says. True cessation says is that you can actually end all suffering, which again, to us, I think sounds a little bit unbelievable because, we look around our world, we say, who is there that's not suffering? So this is going to require a little bit of explanation. But Buddha said, it is possible to cure this disease of suffering. And he says, I know that it's true because I've done it. And I can teach you, and then that's the fourth noble truth path, the true path. He says, not only did I do it, but I was once a human just like you, but I found the path, the method for curing Buddhism. So it's like the treatment, if you like, in the medical analogy, the medicine or whatever the treatment is that cures the disease. And Buddha says, I know all of this is possible because I've done it. I have achieved full enlightenment and I've done it. And moreover, in Buddha's world, as I explained in the first teaching last week, is a causal world. There's nothing random in Buddhism. Everything is cause and effect, including our mental world, not only the physical world. And Buddha said, if you, and in fact, in a sense, there's a hint, because once you say there's a true cause, there's a reason for your suffering, then that, in a sense, is a hint. Well, if you know what the cause is, all you have to do is remove the cause and the suffering will go away. It's the same way, if there's a virus or bacteria, you take the right medicine that kills off the virus or the virus or whatever it is, then you cure the disease. In the same way, Buddha said there's a cause to your suffering. And the way that this method works is you remove the cause of that suffering. And when you remove that cause of that suffering, then you achieve the release from all suffering. And that's sometimes called nirvana. And the state that you achieve when you achieve it is sometimes again called enlightenment when that happens in your life. And the Buddha said, again, if you follow exactly what I did, you will get exactly the same result because there is this cause and effect. So if you create the causes to end your suffering, then you will definitely end your suffering. And so the key thing is you have to know, how do you do this? What is this method? How do you remove, what are the causes and how do you remove it? And so that is what the core, and that's why this is the core teaching of Buddhism, because all Buddhism is about enlightenment, removing the cause of suffering. And they all, and in every form you do, you may have different specific techniques, but all of these techniques are designed to remove the cause of suffering. And in fact, Buddha, part of it, it's actually very useful if there's so many different forms of Buddhism, because essentially, and sometimes they say that Buddha taught 84,000 teachings. I don't know where the 84,000 teachings comes from. There are often these sayings in Buddhism. I never quite, in the deep vat of history or whatever. But nonetheless, the 84,000 number is helpful because it means just a very large number. So essentially, and this was something that Buddha talked about when he was alive. He basically said that all of us are different. We all need different techniques. It's the same way, humans are different. They respond to medicine different. People that have various illnesses, they have maybe 4 or 5, maybe lots of different drugs they can take, because some drugs work on certain people and other drugs don't work on people. And Buddha said it's the same way in this. There's certain practices that are more effective for some people and other practices that are more helpful for other people. And so when the Buddha taught, he always tried to teach many different things. So one issue, for example, that may come up that we will talk about is anger. In Buddhism, anger is considered essentially not a good thing. It's a very unpleasant state of sight. It's a form of suffering, actually. And so the Buddha taught huge numbers of different ways of stopping your suffering. And most of these ways, as I will explain, involve certain ways of thinking about the world in a very helpful way that can bring you to change your behavior. But anyway, I think this is too abstract and it doesn't make any sense until we go into it more deeply. You need really examples of this sort of stuff. So those in a nutshell are what the Four Noble Truths are. And in a sense, you can sort of have an idea of how it works. So the goal is that we have to understand our suffering, we have to understand what causes it, and we've got to find methods to eliminate it. Okay, so now let's turn to the first one, the truth of suffering. So suffering, actually the word that Buddha used for suffering was not suffering. He used a word which is dukkha in Sanskrit. I think it's the same in Pali. And dukkha actually is a little bit more general than suffering. It really means something closer to dissatisfaction. So when you say that we live in a suffering world, it doesn't mean that we're, experiencing huge amounts of pain every moment. But what the Buddha is really saying is that everything about our world is unsatisfactory in some way. And so that's the key idea. And so the idea is really to explore this notion of being, what does it mean to be unsatisfactory? Why is everything unsatisfactory? How do we experience that? So in the traditional teachings, one way that's helpful is Buddha taught that there are three types of suffering. And so this is the way that we can sort of begin to expand this notion of suffering. So the first one is called manifest suffering, or the suffering of suffering. And this first manifest suffering is what we all normally mean by suffering. That means real physical pain or mental pain, mental anguish. We're going to talk a little bit more about the mental side. There's a huge focus on Buddhism on the mind, because it's really our mind that controls all of our experiences. And so I'm going to talk more detail. That's extremely important. So I'm going to talk in more detail about that. So, so that's the first form of suffering. And, and I think for all of us, it's manifest. I mean, is there anybody that we know that goes through without experiencing suffering? And in fact, the Buddha mentioned these three obvious types of suffering in the beginning, which was the suffering of illness. Almost everybody goes through some illness. Some people are rather lucky and don't go through much. Other people go through huge amounts, terrible diseases like cancer and other things. The other major suffering that's obvious is aging, which is something that I'm very aware of now. And we all become aware of this as it happens. And that's sort of a no-brainer. And of course, the other suffering is the suffering that we all die. And for most people, that arouses huge anxiety. Although in Buddhism, we actually teach people how to die. And you can actually go through death with absolutely no anxiety whatsoever. So, but we will talk more about that. But anyway, and then of course, another very useful notion of, this actually speaks maybe more to dissatisfaction rather than manifest suffering. But the other thing the Buddha talked about, which I always found quite interesting, is about not getting what we want. For a lot of us, that is a real form of suffering. It's like for most of us, we're always trying to get stuff, but we're always spoiled. It's like we all want to be extremely wealthy, have gigantic houses, fancy cars, never be sick. We always want, amazing spouses or whatever. So, we always want all these fabulous things. And of course, we're frustrated over and over again. And that is a form of dissatisfaction. And that happens almost every second of our life. So that is really all over the place. Another one is the sort of the opposite of that, which I think is very helpful. It's having to encounter what we don't want to encounter, like going to the dentist. You know, we're always coming into these situations. Or you're driving home and all this traffic is in your way, or you go to the grocery store and you've run out of we're always encountering things that we don't want to encounter. And these last two, I think, are actually very helpful because they're sort of pervasive in our life. They're always there and they're happening over and over again. So even if you don't experience the biggies, you know, maybe you're lucky, you're very healthy and so forth. Maybe you're still young, you haven't hit old age yet, and you're still young, so you haven't died yet. So, but nonetheless, we have all of these other things going on and our lives are dissatisfactory. Okay, so now the next one is something that really gets more to the heart of Buddhism. And that's called the suffering of change. And the suffering of change is something that you wouldn't normally think of as a suffering. And so it takes some thought and some experience with it. But actually, the more you think about it, this is almost more terrible than the first one. And what the suffering of change has to do with is that everything in life is impermanent. Everything changes constantly. There's nothing in our world that is permanent. And so part of this part is so again, I think you need examples to sort of see this in operation. So what it means is, you know, if you achieve some really good thing, huge amount of money, it's always uncertain. You can't be sure you can hold on to it. You know, you can think about the stock market crash of 1929, where you had these people who had fabulous amounts of wealth and they had the stock market crash and suddenly they were impoverished. And for a lot of these people, their suffering was so intense, they were killing themselves. They were throwing themselves. At that time, New York didn't really have skyscrapers. You could open the windows and people were opening the windows and throwing themselves out of tall buildings. You know, they couldn't stand the thought of having to give up all their money and be impoverished. It was just beyond belief for them. And actually, it's like that for everything. There is nothing dependable in life. No matter what you get, it can always disappear the next moment. Or you can be a billionaire and then get cancer, and maybe you're going to die in 3 months. You know, it's like there's nothing that you could hold on to life. So even the good things in life you can't hold on to. And even temporary pleasures aren't satisfactory and that's where the dissatisfaction comes. Because if you get good things, those good things are also suffering because you can't hang on to them. So imagine going and getting the most fabulous meal you can get, like one of the most delicious things of something you've ever had. It only lasts a moment and then it's gone. You can't hang on to it. And even a lot of times, if you try to recreate it, you go back to the same restaurant or something, it's still not as good as that original impression. And so that's the way it is with everything. You buy a new car and your new car isn't new forever. It eventually gets old. Everything wears out. You know, your health isn't dependable. You may be in very good health, but maybe tomorrow you'll be in a car crash and you'll be in tremendous pain, you know? So that's, and it's sort of this notion of, again, you know, it's everything. So even good things. And the other thing Buddha said is that, I mean, the other thing too is think about, let's say you have a wonderful, beautiful new car that you just absolutely adore. You know, different people, you can translate this to whatever you absolutely love, but some people love new cars. I don't actually care that much about cars, but for many people, you know, having a fabulous car of a certain type gives them intense pleasure. But then imagine going into a Trader Joe's parking lot and watching it get scratched and demolished. You know, and then when this good thing gets, you know, scratched or hurt, or somebody runs through a red light and hits you, you know, then you get really angry and upset, you know, because your wonderful possession is harmed. And it's sort of like that with everything. So even if you have something really good, you always worry about it. It's a source of anxiety. You know, people that have tons of money are always worried about how to protect it, what investments, is there any safe investment that they can put their money into that will keep it secure or whatever. So everything is a source of anxiety and difficulty. And even for us that have children, you know, the children is the greatest joy in life, but all parents worry about their kids. They, you know, they're constantly, I mean, my mother, who just died recently, she was almost 100. She talked about that. There was no point in her life when she didn't think about her kids and what was happening to them and what they, and worrying about any little thing that happened. So all of our most precious possessions are also a source of suffering. And so this suffering, and of course, that there are the bad things that happen also, but life is a continual roller coaster with no certainty. And that uncertainty, that anything can change at every moment, in fact, will at some point. You know, no matter what good thing you have or whatever you have, even if you can hold on to your wealth to death, you'll lose your wealth at death. So there's that aspect that makes all of our life dissatisfactory. There's just no safety anywhere. And in fact, this world that we talk about, that we live in, is called samsara. And this is going to be the true thing for all of samsara. And that is an interesting source of suffering. And the other final source of suffering is something that probably I can't describe very well here. It's called pervasive suffering. But there is a notion that there is actually a real reason why everything in samsara is a form of suffering, is unsatisfactory. And that's because the cause of being in samsara is going to be known to be sort of caused by a negative state of mind. It's actually going to be caused by a form ultimately of ignorance. But that requires a lot more explanation. But there is actually a reason why sometimes they talk about it, the world being contaminated or impure. You know, sometimes the language is not necessarily so helpful to us, but there's something not quite so good. You know, certainly samsara is really problematic. And the closer you look at it, the more problematic it is. And there is a cause for being in samsara, and there is some negative aspects to that cause. So it's not surprising that the result has these negative aspects of being filled with dukkha or unsatisfactoriness. But again, that will require a little more explanation, and we'll have to go into that a little more deeply. Okay, let me just stop. Are there any questions now? I mean, I think some things I haven't explained. Yeah, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and just speak.
Hi. Great talk. Thank you. I don't have any questions. I've been kind of following along with casually studying Buddhism a good part of my life. But if you could elaborate perhaps a little bit more on pervasive suffering.
Okay. I will come into that a little bit more. Well, let me go back into some of the more other noble truths, and I will come back and talk about that, because that's going to be bound up in notions called delusions and afflictions, the cause of suffering. So, and since this is the cause and the negation, I think it's more natural. If I don't answer your question there, come back and ask again. But I will try to talk about that, because you're right, that is the thing that's more difficult, but you need more information, more background before it becomes understandable. So let me just push ahead on that a little bit. Are there any other questions, or?
Oh, no. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Okay. So now, okay. So now we've gone into that our life is suffering, and again, all these things will come up over and over again, but let's go into, there is a cause of suffering. And in Buddhism, they actually talk about two different causes of Buddhism, although ultimately it collapses into one. And so you can organize these things different way, almost like some of these dolls that are one inside the other. So the common thing that's said is that the cause of suffering is twofold: karma, and this other thing, which is sometimes translated as delusions or afflictions. The actual Sanskrit word is klesha, and it's sometimes translated as either a delusion or affliction. And as I describe this, I'll explain, it actually has both qualities. And as I go deeper into that, I will explain that. So we have these karma. So let me talk about in a certain sense, in a nutshell, the cause of our suffering are negative states of mind. And that's ultimately these delusions or afflictions, which are then going to give rise to karma, which are then going to result in either in various experiences that we have. So that's sort of the big picture, but let me take it step by step. So one thing that is helpful in Buddhism is that it does talk about rebirth. So in Buddhism, we do talk about rebirth. Again, in Buddhism, you don't have to believe anything. You don't have to believe in rebirth. And there are Buddhists who don't believe in rebirth. But I think actually to understand karma, you almost sort of do need to understand rebirth. But essentially, the way that Buddhism works is that you don't have to believe anything. And it's best actually to hold off believing anything until you actually do believe it. So if rebirth or things like that seem very strange, what we always tell people is just don't worry about it. Just focus on the other aspects of Buddhism. And eventually, as you get more teachings and you see how things are more connected, then usually for most people, they actually do come to believe in karma and rebirth. But anyway, what the Buddha said is he said that, and the Buddha said that this for him was not a theory, that when he was under the Bodhi tree and became enlightened, he could actually directly see people being reborn into various realms. And he could actually see how karma worked. He could see what caused people to be reborn and where they were reborn, and also have the experiences that they experienced in each of these different realms. And he said, basically, the Buddha said, is that once you reach a certain level of on the spiritual path, you'll be able to see this directly for yourself as well. Okay, so first of all, what Buddha said is he said that there are actually 6 realms of samsara. And these 6 realms are very briefly, there are hell realms, there's hungry ghost realms, which these 2 things are bad. There's animal realms, that's also bad. Human realms, which is good, and 2 different types of godlike realms. And the Buddha said that depending on whether we create negative karma or positive karma, we can be born into these different realms. And but the important thing of all of these realms is that they're all temporary. So if you're born in a hell realm, you don't stay there forever, but eventually you burn up your negative karma and you're born in a higher realm. If you're born in a godlike realm, you've created huge amounts of positive karma to be born there. But as you experience the pleasures of the godlike realms, that burns up that positive karma. And then when you run out of positive karma, you fall back down into the lower realms. And so the view of Buddhism is actually all these different realms, or it's like almost like a chipmunk going around a wheel, And the Buddha said there have been times in the past, and the Buddha said we've had basically infinite previous lives. The Buddha said he never saw a beginning to people's lives in samsara. And so essentially for all of us, we've been God-like realms before, we've been in hell-like realms before, but all of these states of existence are unsatisfactory. Certainly the God-like realms brings you temporary pleasure, but if you think about it, again, if you know that once you achieve a godlike realm, that eventually you're going to lose it and fall below, what could be more terrible than that? Because the worst thing of all is to have something great and to lose it. And so I think that actually being in a godlike realm would be actually very frightening because you can't hang on to it. And in fact, what the Buddha said, the Buddha actually said that if you have a choice, the best realm to pick is the human realm. And the reason for picking the human realm is because in the human realm, you have the best chance out of this whole thing. Because actually, the final escape from suffering is to get out of the game entirely, to leave samsara. And that's what nirvana is. Nirvana is liberation from samsara. And the Buddha said this is possible because we ourselves, in our own mental attitudes, create the causes to continue to be reborn in samsara. And so the ultimate, deepest goal of Buddhism is as a form of ignorance that causes us to be reborn in samsara. And the Buddha said it's actually seeing the world as it really is, penetrating that and understanding that enables you, removing that ignorance that causes you to be reborn in samsara is what causes us to achieve nirvana. And of course, this requires a lot more explanation, but that's sort of the big picture. That's sort of the way it's basically supposed to work. And again, I mean, you know, when we're talking in this section of the course, I think it's a little bit, there's a danger of becoming too heavy with this, because being Americans, we're so goal-oriented that immediately you hear this and say, I've got to do nirvana tomorrow. You know, it's like it becomes this fixed goal, and it becomes this sort of thing like nothing matters except achieving nirvana. You know, forget everything else. We just got to do this. And I think that is mistaken. I mean, to counter that, what the Buddha really talked about, the Buddha said that Buddhism or Dharma is good in the beginning, it's good in the middle, and it's good in the end. By that, what Buddha meant is roughly practicing Buddhism helps you now in the present moment to lead a better life, to lead a more satisfactory life. It helps you even after you've been studying Buddhism for a long time. It still continues to help improve your life. And at the end, when you're almost achieving nirvana, you're still improving your life. It's like this practice of Dharma or Buddhism is beneficial no matter where you are, whatever stage you're on. And to me, actually, you know, as I mentioned in the first class, the main reason I practice Buddhism is because it enables me to lead a sane life in an insane world. And it makes my life better moment by moment. And again, that's going to require some understanding. And again, I mean, the way you actually appreciate this is by practicing Buddhism. But I will give one example that I gave last week, which I find, in fact, I practice every day. It's almost not even Buddhist. It's so simple. But it's actually a very interesting thought experiment, actually just an experiment. And so the experiment is very simple. When you're wandering around in your day, driving down the road, maybe at the grocery store, look at the person next to you and just think to yourself, may that person be happy. And really try to believe that as much as you can. Even though the person is a stranger, you don't know who they are, you have no reason why they should be happy, just try to intensely think that thought as best you can. And then follow that up with, may you never suffer. May you never experience any type of suffering or pain. So may you be happy and may you not suffer. And just think that about that person. And so if you're in traffic and the person cuts in front of you and blocks your way, instead of getting angry, you think, oh, that person, you know, I'm glad that you're getting ahead of me, that you're making progress, that it makes you happy to get there faster. May you be happy. And may you not experience the suffering or frustration of being delayed from your goal. Or, you know, and do this, just all the people around you, do that, you know, with anyone you run into, just think, you know, and really try to, even though, again, it's sort of a fake thing, you know, a little bit, but just try to do it. You know, you're in the grocery store, you look at the person, you know, that's, you know, who you're paying the groceries to, the cashier or whatever, think, may you be happy. May you never suffer ever again. Think of the person ahead of you in line. Think that thought. And then watch your mind and see how you feel. And if you're like most people, you will feel happy. You will experience a type of happiness. And it's a very pure form of happiness because it's completely selfless, completely egoless. You know, has no ego involved, no sense of yourself involved. And it's an amazing practice. And there's actually a more elaborate form that require more explanation, but these first two are enough. They were actually, they have various names for it. But the Buddha actually said that if you think about karma, these practices generate more positive karma than almost any other practice you can do, especially if you can broaden it. So you can, so not only picking out individual people, but you can think of, may all my neighbors be happy. May they never experience suffering. May all the people in the United States be happy. May they never experience suffering. May everyone in the world, even animals and insects, may they be happy and may they never experience suffering. And it's said that the amount of karma that you generate depends on sort of the number of people almost that you express this with. But I think in terms of a practice, it's just a very interesting practice to just see how you experience it, what emotions it brings up in front of you, you know, inside of you. And I think also my experience, I try to practice this actually every day, because for me, it makes a huge extent. So I'm talking about, Shayla just rejoined us, talking about this practice of wishing everybody to be happy and not experience suffering. And it's an extraordinary practice. And you you do it with your spouse, with your kids, you know, if your parents are alive, with your relatives, and see how it changes your relationship with all of these people. You know, and in my mind, this is it's the simplest way to completely change your life with a very simple practice, because it just affects how you think about all the other people in the world around you. And the more you do it, the more profound it is. And it's extraordinary. And as I said, you know, the Buddha really recommended it. So anyway, so I mean, you know, it's those sorts of things where I think that Buddhism really helps. You know, you need to not only think about achieving nirvana, removing all the negative, painful aspects of your mind, which are these delusions and afflictions, but actually you have to see how Buddhism helps you moment by moment feel better about yourself, about your life, to make your life more meaningful and happier. And Buddhism can do that moment. Even if you never achieve nirvana in this life, your life can be so much better than it is now. And that's the main reason I see for practicing, doing all of these Buddhist practices, is because they have immediate benefit. They will, if you practice them, eventually lead to nirvana, to full happiness. And through positive karma, you know, it's wonderful things will happen to you. There was one Buddhist nun I knew who, whenever she used to travel a lot to various Buddhist activities, and at one point she noticed that she always ended up being bumped up to business class or first class, even though she didn't ask for it. And even though she didn't have the points for this to happen, this just kept happening over and over again. And what was interesting about it was that, so for us, this sounds wonderful. And I'm sure that it was being credited. You know, she's a very wonderful Buddhist nun. You know, I'm sure she's generating huge amounts of positive karma, and that was causing all of these good things to happen. But from her point of view, she thought this was terrible. And the reason why she thought this was terrible is another interesting aspect of karma, is you actually need good karma to advance your spiritual life. In fact, our founder of our traditions, Tsongkhapa, did millions of various things to generate positive karma in order to generate a realization of emptiness, which is the deepest understanding of reality in Buddhism. But even though he was a child prodigy, it was absolutely brilliant. He couldn't achieve this understanding or realization until he had generated the positive karma to make it happen. And for this nun, her thinking was very similar. Why am I wasting all of this good karma on better airplane tickets, better airplane seats? Well, I want this good karma to be used for realizations. So she said various prayers and stuff, requesting this never to happen again, and it didn't. So it's anyway. So this Buddhist way of thinking is, as I say, very, very different than our ordinary ways of thinking. So at any rate, yeah, I'm not sure where I got off at this point. So anyway, we have all of these different realms of samsara, but I would say it's not that important, I mean, because again, basically you just want to generate as much good karma as you can and try to overcome all of your negative tendencies that cause this negative karma. And again, this negative karma, besides causing painful experiences in this life or in future lives, it also creates obstructions to your spiritual life. It blocks you from achieving higher spiritual realizations as well. And that's something that often a lot of times people overlook. But people who are really focused on the spiritual life really worry about that. And Tsongkhapa, when he was trying to achieve this realization of emptiness, he did there are certain spiritual practices that pacify or remove your negative karma. So he did huge amounts of this to remove his obstructions. And then he did these other practices that generate huge amounts of positive karma in order to achieve this realization. So anyway, that's just a different way of thinking about these things. So I'm not going to say a lot about these other realms. I mean, most of these other realms are inaccessible to us, like the hell realms and the heavenly realms. But I can say that people talk about, there are sort of resembling hell realms and resembling heavenly realms in our own human life. I mean, there are people who just spontaneously generate wealth, are healthy, seem to lead just, a heavenly life. It's almost like it's a heaven on earth. Nothing bad ever seems to happen to. And so there is a cause of that. They must have generated huge amounts of positive karma to generate that. There's other peoples on our human life and terrible parts of Africa and places that have horrendous suffering, whose life is just misery after misery. And so we see this full gamut. And that's the other aspect of karma. So karma actually has, I'm going to come into it more, it has several aspects. One aspect is that when you die, it can throw you into these various realms. But then the other aspect of it is that it also colors how you experience those realms. So there's a wide range of experiences in each realm. So in the human realm, like I say, you can be practically gods on earth, or you can be practically hell beings on earth. You see that in animals. I mean, some of our pets live a very luxurious life. They're almost like little gods on earth, and there's other animals that are eaten and experience horrendous suffering. So it's like that with all of these things, and that is caused by these aspects of karma. And karma is actually tricky, because the way they talk about it is they say that each of our actions implants a karmic seed. Most of our actions are neutral, neither good nor bad. And so most of the results are neutral. If we do negative actions, it creates negative karma that creates obstructions, suffering in the future, either in this life or future lives. And if we do virtuous or positive actions, it creates positive karma. And basically the best way to understand so you ask, what is virtuous or what is non-virtuous in Buddhism? In a nutshell, if you are harming yourself or others, that is negative. If you are doing the opposite of that, helping people, being beneficial, that is creating positive karma. So the Buddha gave actually 10 different ways of creating negative karma. It's all the things that you think about: stealing, killing, all of the sort of the negative things that you think of, but they all involve some sort of harming. And so and in fact, Buddha, he wasn't a literalist. What the Buddha always talked about was, when you look at an action, you have to see what the intention of an action. It's really the intention of our minds that creates our karma. If the intention is the harm, then that is going to create negative karma. So, for example, sometimes we accidentally harm people by accident. That doesn't create negative karma. It's only when we have the intention to harm people that it creates this negative karma. And it's the same way. I mean, to create positive karma, you have to have this intention to benefit people in some way. And so in a nutshell, I think that's the easy, and it depends, because there are situations in life where it may look like we're harming somebody. Sometimes teachers yell at their students, even Buddhist teachers, and act like they're getting really angry and stuff, and act like they're being really horrible or whatever. But sometimes that's the only way to stimulate the students to better behavior, or better to act better. And so that may actually be positive karma, because the intention of the teacher may be trying to really help the student in the only way the teacher can see. So again, Buddhists are not literal. You always have to look at the specifics of any situation and try very hard to understand what you're doing. Am I harming or am I benefiting people? And that requires wisdom. And that's something that requires you have to develop over time. And that requires being able to see more deeply into the way the world really works. And the thing that's very helpful there is meditation, actually, especially mindfulness meditation. So we'll talk a little bit more. We haven't talked much about meditation, but the one thing that Buddha talked over and over again is he said to his monks, look, whatever you do, meditate. And there's a reason for that, because meditation is a way, there's two main types of meditation: mindfulness meditation and single-pointed meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a way where we can become more objective at looking at the world we live in and seeing the way it really works, and seeing how all of our emotions and everything arises for us. And single-pointed meditation, where you focus on a single meditation object, develops a very, very powerful mind that can penetrate any object that it tries to understand. And so in Buddhism, we try to do both, and both have their uses, and we use different types of meditation and different parts in our spiritual practice to accomplish different things. But meditation is extraordinarily powerful, because as we keep talking, you're going to see more and more. Everything is what really matters, is what goes on in your mind. In karma, there can be a physical manifestation. You can actually hit somebody or harm somebody physically, but the real karma is generated by the intention in your mind. And the physical thing just adds to the intensity of the karmic seeds that you plant. So we plant these karmic seeds, and then it's said that these karmic seeds ripen either in our present lifetime or in future lifetimes. And there are causes and conditions that cause these positive or negative seeds of karma to ripen. And a lot of that has to do with the current conditions. And that's where you are in your spiritual journey is so important. Because if you are practicing as a spiritual practitioner, you can actually tend to ripen more positive karmic seeds and ripen fewer negative. But, the way you are, because karma is not a one-to-one thing. So if you kill somebody in the past, that doesn't cause you to be killed in the future. That may manifest, if you're a really good Buddhist practicing today, maybe you killed somebody in a previous lifetime. If you have a very strong spiritual practice, maybe in this lifetime, it'll manifest as a headache or something like that, maybe a much ameliorated form. So that is the other reason for actually focusing on the present. Who knows what karmic seeds we've created in the past? It doesn't matter. There are practices you can for purifying these things, which I tend to do every day. And so you can learn these things, but the most important thing is just working on your spiritual life, trying to be a better person moment by moment. Also, not only are you creating positive karma for the future, but you're also influencing how this past karma ripens. So it matters. So who you are at each and every moment really matters. And so again, we get caught up in these grandiose things, nirvana, whatever. But really focusing on the present moment is so, so important. See, let me just stop here. Are there any questions at this point? Now I'm going to get into the delusions. So answer, is it Stephen? Is that your name? Did I get it right? Okay, I'm terrible with names. I'm sure I'll mash it up a few times, but anyway. So anyway, coming back to that, so that's roughly the idea of karma. Now, the key thing about karma is that karma, what causes us to create all these various actions? That's a critical component because, a lot of times, especially maybe anger is a good example. When you become anger, a lot of times anger just spontaneously arises. And it seems like wildfire. Somebody just says something and, and you fly off the handle before anything can happen. It's like instantaneous. So if your goal is to control anger, you say, well, how can I do that? And to do that, you have to understand what causes these negative states of mind. And anger is actually an example of a delusion or an affliction. So these delusions or afflictions actually come in various things. The root of it all, the very foundation of all of it, is a notion that's called ignorance. And the main ignorance is a sense that we have this permanent self. And it's much more complicated than that, but that's just the beginning. And so the main teaching of ignorance is something called selflessness. Another term that comes is emptiness. And we're going to talk much more in detail about this in the fourth class. But basically, just a crude way of, it's far more subtle than this. One has to go at these things that hit them at different levels and go deeper and deeper. But a very crude form of this is that we have the sense that we have this permanent self. And because we have the sense that we have this permanent self, we have this crude sense that we can be permanently happy. And because we think we can become permanently happy, we think, oh, I only need this, and then I'll be permanent. All I need is more wealth, or I need, a beautiful spouse, or I need a healthy body, and then I'll be happy. So we always have these things, but it's ultimately, if you trace it back down to it, there's a sense of this sort of permanent self, and the sense that, we just need one thing. And again, we lose track of the fact that everything is impermanent, everything changes. You can't hold on to anything. So even if you get this fabulous thing that you want, it won't stay the same. It'll change. It won't make you as happy. It's like the kid at Christmas who is waiting for Santa Claus to deliver the presents, and he knows what he wants and he can't wait, and he's thinking about it, and he's so excited. He gets more excited. And then finally he gets the present on Christmas. A few seconds later, he's bored and he throws it away. That's the way life really is. That's the way it is for everything for us. And again, it's worth thinking about this. Is there anything that if you got one single thing that would make you eternally happy for the rest of your life? Is there any one single thing that you wouldn't get bored with? Even people that go on pornography sites, they have to go to stronger and stronger forms of pornography because they get bored. And it's like that with everything. We get bored with everything. And even if you go to your favorite restaurant, no matter how fabulous the food is, eventually you'll get bored with it. And it's like, and so you have to sort of understand that. And so that's why it's interesting, because Socrates himself said the same thing. He thought that the root of all problems in life was ignorance also, but his was very different. But nonetheless, there is this ignorance root. And again, it's very complex, it's very subtle, and there's different understandings of it. So I just tried to give you just a crude beginning of it, and we will talk more about it as we go along. But anyway, from ignorance comes the other two root forms of afflictions or illusions, which are basically greed and hate. So greed, you can think of roughly as wanting stuff for you. You want all the best stuff. You want to be the first person in line. You want wealth. You want the best cake. You want the best car, the biggest house. It's all of these things because somehow we think that if we get all these things, it'll make us happy. The opposite of that is hatred, which is pushing away the things we don't like. So, suffering any type of ill health, being poor, there's certain people we don't like. It's like, so hatred always involves sort of a pushing away. And from that sprang all the other things like jealousy, and you can think of lots of other delusions. But these delusions have certain aspects to them that are absolutely critical. One thing is exaggeration. And that's where you get to the delusion aspect of calling this klesha delusions, is they're always an exaggeration. So in greed, whatever you want, we blow it up in our mind and make it far more fabulous and wonderful than it really is. So if you're hungry and you're walking past a shop and you see this slice of chocolate cake or whatever it is, it's like in our mind, we exaggerate how wonderful it's going to taste, how absolutely great it's going to be. Or you get a bank robber who thinks of robbing a bank. He thinks about all the wonderful things he'll do with that money, and he just exaggerates how wonderful it was. So it's that exaggeration. Or it goes the opposite way. You have somebody you don't like, and you think about them over and over and obsess with them and think about all the horrible things you dislike about it. And then you blow them up into this horrible boogeyman where they're just the most horrendous person on earth. And we don't see any of their good qualities. We don't see any acts of kindness or anything. We just focus on all the negatives. So that's how these delusions work. They always involve exaggerations. For things we want, we blow up all the things that are good about them. We exaggerate them horrendously, and we only focus on those good things. We never look at the negative aspects. It's like the people falling in love. In the beginning, they only see the good aspects of the person they're falling in love with. And then later on, they discover the negative ones very slowly. Hopefully it doesn't make a difference. But anyway, we do this. We do this everything in life. We focus, we exaggerate everything. So that's a huge aspect of delusions, and that's why they're delusions, they're distortions. The other huge important part about all these delusions or afflictions is that if you examine them, and it's very helpful again to do these mindfulness meditations, if you examine these things very closely, you discover that they're painful states of mind. They're things that you really don't want. And so part of Buddhism is actually watching your mind very carefully. What states of mind are actually good? The Buddha actually tended to use the word wholesome or unwholesome, kusala or akusala. And so that's, and it's very important to pay attention to that. And so the real reason, whether you want nirvana or not, you want to make your life pleasant moment by moment. And if you want to make your life pleasant, you want to get rid of these delusions. First of all, you want to recognize them, because a lot of times we don't even know they're going on. And secondly, you need techniques for first damping them down a little bit and then eventually getting rid of them. And you have to see them in operation, and you have to come, again, it's this ignorance and knowing. You have to understand for yourself, see it directly. These things are painful. You don't want these things. And so in a certain sense, so that's why I say that, you can think about nirvana and everything, but the more important thing that I think about is actually you're making your life better moment by moment. And actually, Buddhism is all about seeing the world as accurately, as truthful as possible. That's why the Dalai Lama doesn't worry about science. The Dalai Lama says, if science says something is true and Buddhism says it's false, believe the science. Because you don't have to worry, because Buddhism is about truth, about the world, the way the world really is. You don't have to be anxious about it. Buddhism will only lead to truth about the way things really are. And the most important things in our life are actually these internal mental states. Because, quite frankly, if you get an injury, like maybe you twist your leg, you twist your knee, let's say, and your knee is really hurting, there is the physical pain of the knee, but actually far worse of it is the mental pain that you experience. Because what happens again is, for most of us, we twist our knee and that's all we do. We obsess about the knee. We think about how painful it is, how horrible it is, how much it prevents us from doing the things we want to do. We just focus, we do this huge exaggeration and we blow it up to this terrible thing. So if you look at most of your life, you'll discover that actually the greatest pains in life are mental suffering. And that's what Buddhism really focuses on, this mental thing. And in Buddhism, you can reach a state where you can have physical suffering and just it doesn't bother you in the least. And again, that takes a strong type of mind. But you have to really, again, these are things that you have to explore on your own and see whether you think that they're really true or not. But I think for most people, if you really look at it very closely and focus on not only what's happening to you, or maybe somebody rams into your car and your car is damaged, you know, what's so painful about that? You'll discover what's really painful about it is just, again, think, oh, it's my car, it got damaged, I love this car. Or maybe it's the pain, I can't, God, it's such a pain to go take it to the garage, or maybe it's so expensive. You'll discover that it's really your mind which is causing, a bent fender is just a bent fender. But it's our mind that blows it up to be such a terrible thing. Or maybe not. There's some people, maybe you get a fender bender and it doesn't bother you. Oh, it's just another complicated thing I have to add to my life. One more thing that I have to add to my list to do is what, people vary with that very, very much. And there are people who you barely touch them and they feel extreme pain. And there's other people you can practically lop off an arm and they hardly notice it. And so a lot of this has to do with your mind, and that's something that one has to explore. So I've passed 8:30 now, and I don't like to keep people too long, but I think this is the main thing for understanding about the cause of suffering, and so you can sort of begin to see how focusing on these delusions and afflictions, and then these result in karma, and this karma comes back and affects you. But nonetheless, maybe this is just the beginning to begin to sort of get some of these ideas across. And Buddhism is like this. I mean, it's a very different way of thinking. So it takes some time to sort of get used to it and sort of see it in operation and get a lot of examples, because it's a very funny way of looking at the world, different than the way we normally used to. But I find it absolutely a very beautiful way of looking at the world. And like I say, I find it's a way for me, I don't know, to make myself happy moment by moment. And so I see that as the actual goal. So I only got through half of the Four Noble Truths, but the rest of it will go fairly quickly, because I think these beginning parts are the things that are really important. And so after this, so what I'm going to do for the next session is go on from here and then finish the Four Noble Truths, which we can do fairly quickly, but then get on to actually a spiritual path. Because in our tradition, there's actually first Atisha and then some Kappa developed what they called Lam Rim, a path to enlightenment. And it's an organized way of going through all of the different spiritual practices you need, from the very beginning stages to the most advanced stages near full enlightenment. So it outlines sort of a whole way of traversing this full path. It's actually remarkable that you can do this. But this is the main method. But in doing this, it actually takes you through most of the main vocabulary that you need, that you get in all the other Buddhist class. Things like guru, renunciation, bodhicitta, emptiness, just all sorts of other tons of various terminology. And so the whole point of going through this is to I mean, I can't give you all of the details. I mean, I'm always sort of torn between giving you enough details to sort of get an idea for how it works. But the more important thing is the big picture, to see how the whole thing works and how all of these different aspects reinforce each other, and how you need, actually what Tsongkhapa said, he said, you need all these teachings. You can't throw any of them away, because they all reinforce each other and they all help you in different ways. At various steps in your spiritual path, you may focus on one aspect more than another, but you actually need all of them because they all sort of work together. And so seeing that big picture, but also getting all that terminology so that when you go into other Buddhist classes, you know immediately roughly what they're talking about, why you should care about it, and where it's all leading to, and how it fits into the broader picture. So that's sort of my goal for this course. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. I hope I'm not, again, talking over your head. I mean, I've been doing Buddhism long enough. It's easy for me to just sort of run over you, but I'm trying to, as much as I can, keep it simple. So are there any last questions before we stop for today? Stephen?
Just hitting my space bar to talk. No, I don't have any questions. We'll be back for the next installments, and we appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you very much. And the first class that you missed, if you go, you're supposed to be able to watch it on YouTube. I haven't checked, but they usually put it on YouTube. So you can catch up with that, where I talk more about sort of background Buddhist attitudes and introduction. But
we'll watch and we'll stay tuned.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's late for us. We're 2 hours ahead of you. So
oh yeah, I will let you go. I'm sorry for keeping you late. It's always hard.
Good night. Peace.
Okay, good night. We'll see you all next week.